so excited that Mica is finally here because we have known each other now for several years.
Yeah.
And her reputation preceded her. We were on a committee for undergraduate STEM research experiences, and I was so excited to come to the committee because I wanted to meet her because I'd written a paper and her work was so impressive. So very excited when I got to meet her. We had lots of fun discussion. We didn't agree on everything. She's totally fun to discuss with because she just has a great attitude. She just listens, she says what she thinks, and I say what I think, and we usually worked it out.
Yeah, we did.
We had a lot of fun.
Yes.
It was a really fascinating committee. I would say some people didn't listen as much as we did, but we tried to model the listening. I think we came up with a really good report, and it's had a lot of play, so it's been very exciting. Just to give you a little background, Mica got her PhD from Harvard, which we will forgive her. But she did work at Berkeley before that, which was good. So, she's, been able to bridge two cultures. And she's currently at UCSF, where she's doing longitudinal work that she's going to talk about today. And she's done so many interesting longitudinal studies. And I'm really excited about her current work, which is on kindness and community. And I think that this is an area that has been severely neglected. And it's fascinating that you're willing to take it on. She has a couple of review articles out that I don't have, but I know that she recently came out with a paper that I thought was really interesting on the role of social influences on pro-environment behavior in the San Diego region, where she's actually trying to study how to get people to have a more positive attitude towards the environment and care for it, which I think fits into kindness and community. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. So I'll say two things. One is that Marcia and I did not always agree, and I think it says something about both of us that we were able to move through all of that really intellectual, heavy stuff, and yet I think we both respected each other and enjoy each other's company and have continued to keep in contact after. That's not true of everybody on the committee, so. There's a few people I haven't talked to since then. The other thing is that I did my undergrad here in psychology, and I recognized when I came into the entrance that, when you come in, there's one side you go to psychology and one side to the ed school. And this is the first time I went towards the ed school. So this was like I feel like I did something important. And I want to lead with that also because I want to recognize that my training is really in social psychology. And I don't know, how many people here are from the ed school or teaching or involved in the ed school? Okay, so about half of you. So I'm just going to give it up to you. You guys know more about ed school stuff than I do. I really am coming from a social psych perspective. And if you have questions for me that I can't answer because of differences in methodology or whatever, please forgive me. I will try and learn from you today if I can. All right, so I've been doing a lot of research. I cannot fit it all into 1 hour anymore. That's a new thing that I have learned the last about 2 years. And so I'm just going to talk about 2 of my studies today. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the review article that I worked on. And that will lead us kind of in a place of theory in which you guys can help me to understand how next to move my research. And we can discuss a little bit about how we would use this information going forward. So my title, The Influence of Kindness and Community on Broadening Participation in STEM Careers, and let's talk about how we integrate. And what I mean by integrate is how do we integrate into community? How do we integrate into being a part of a group? I'm going to lead with this probably very famous quote that many of you have heard. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves, and all things are bound together, all things connect. That includes us. We connect. And we have to think about what happens when we're not connecting. What happens to that web when pieces don't fit together? So while I'm going to be talking about social psychology, I want you to keep this in your head because I'm going to come back to it later about how do we weave together and in what ways do we fall apart and what are the implications for that in terms of our workforce development. So the traditional way in which we think about going through the pipeline, that's the traditional way of thinking about it. People get their bachelor's degree, they get their master's degree, they get their PhD, they might do a postdoc, optional, and then you go on and you become a scientist. This is the traditional way we think about people going through the academic pipeline. And what we know from the research is that not all groups go through this pipeline at the same way and at the same percentages. So on this slide here, you can see here the population. So does it show here? Yes. So you have the 2010 U.S. population distribution of underrepresented minorities. In this case, we're using the NIH definition, which is African Americans, Native Americans, and Latino or Hispanic. We have so those are in blue. The white group is in kind of that lighter gray, and then there's Asian is the lighter, very light blue, which is hard to see on the screen. But what I want you to see is that 30% of the population are underrepresented minorities. But in terms of bachelor's degree attainment, they only make up a little less than 15%. And when you get to the point of the master's degree, it's really more around 13%. You get to the doctoral degree, it's around 8%. And by the time you get into the associate professor positions, you're down to about 70.3%. So there's underrepresentation, historical underrepresentation, and this underrepresentation and gap gets bigger and bigger the further you go into this pipeline. So what happens? What happens to us, people like me who are going through this pipeline? All kinds of things, right? This isn't my slide. Somebody showed this one time. I thought it was really funny. You know, all the different ways in which you can drop out of work, and you can go into postgraduate training, or you might do all kinds of different things, right? This is my story. This is what happened to me. I got my bachelor's degree. I worked for an environmental group for a couple of years. I got my master's degree, my PhD, and then I dropped out for 10 years, and I stayed home with kids. And then I came back in and did a postdoc 10 years after my PhD. And then I started becoming a contributing scientist. And I actually didn't start a tenure track position until about 3 years ago. So, you know, I'm one of those people that didn't do the pipeline quite the same way. And there's really been a lot of discussion about whether or not we are talking about pipeline or are we talking about pathways. People have career pathways and they go different ways and they come this way and they go that way in this direction. And if we use that analogy to understand how people progress, does that make a difference in the questions that we ask? Okay, so how do educational programs impact chosen career pathways? That was really the research question that I began with. And at the time when I started this research, gosh, about 10 years ago, or 12 years ago actually, there was a problem with the literature. One of the things that happened was when they looked at programs that were developed to try to increase the persistence of underrepresented students in STEM pathways, they often found that the research had no control groups. They were just looking at the group that was going through the process. They had no long-term evaluations. So the programs would get funded. They would do little evaluations. They do evaluations as the program was going. But as soon as the person left the program, they didn't have funding to track those students long term. So they actually didn't really know the long term. In some cases, they tried to interview these students after, and they would get really low response rates. And most of the people that responded were people who had continued, so they didn't really hear from the people who had not continued. So there was no long term. There was no way to examine the mechanisms. So even if you could show that the programs were working, you didn't necessarily know why they were working. Two different questions. So you could know that when people go through this program, they're more likely to persist, but you don't necessarily know what was the mechanism for keeping them in that program. And most of them were retrospective accounts, which were asking people, what do you think happened? Why do you think you stayed here? And many of us know that the research shows that our recollections of why we do the things we do is not actually very accurate. I know it might be surprising to you, but the stories that we tell ourselves about why we do what we do often does not match what really happened. So it was really hard to know whether the reason why some programs were succeeding was just because they were really good at selecting good students. That those students might have done well anyway, even if they hadn't. Without the control groups and without the longitudinal, you don't really know. You don't really know. So at this time, the science study was funded. This is a longitudinal study. I think it's really one of the first longitudinal studies. I know it's the longest longitudinal study of underrepresented minority science students who had a strong interest in pursuing biomedical careers at the onset, that had a group that had been involved in the intervention group and also had a matching group. My team, the team that I worked with, Wes Schultz was the PI on it. I was the co-PI. Paul Hernandez, who if you're familiar with this work, you've probably seen his work published all the time now, came out of this project as well, Anna Woodcock and Victor Rocha. And this study had 1,400 students. Originally, they were undergraduates, and they came from 50 different universities in the United States. Some of these, about 25 of these universities had what is called the RISE program. It's an undergraduate program for underrepresented minorities funded by the National Institute of Health. And about 25 were similar, but did not have the RISE program. And from this, we pulled out our participants. The RISE program is called the Research Initiative for a Scientific Enhancement. How many of you know about the RISE program? Okay, a few of you. All right, so you know, for those who don't know, you get faculty mentorship, there's workshops, you might get some funding, you often have undergraduate research experiences that are funded. So these are the characteristics of many, this is from the directors at that time of what the program elements were. So we use propensity scores to create a matched group. And we didn't do this retrospectively, we did this at the time when we started the study. So for those of you who don't know what propensity scores are, basically you look at variables like their ethnicity, their gender, their GPA, and you statistically create a weight for how likely they would be in the RISE program. And then you find students who are not in RISE programs who have a similar weight. And then you create these two groups. So basically, statistically, they look really similar at time 0. But half are going to go through program, half are not going to go through a program, or in this case, a little more than half don't go through program. So sometimes we had 2 or 3 matches per person. So we have these two groups, and this is how they were matched with the first and secondary variables. We had an online, they would get online surveys twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring. There was an online portal where they could go in and update their information. They also were given $25, and they could get that through Amazon gift code. They could get cash. They got to choose how they were going to get their money. And this went on for 11 years. There were 72% of the sample were women. About 50% were African American, and 40% Latino or Hispanic, and about 1% Native American. And you can see a lot of them were in the biological sciences. This was really reflective of what the people looked like who were in RISE program. So this was true to that time period when we started. We didn't create these demographics. One of the things that has gotten a lot of attention about our study is that our retention rate has been extremely high. Our average response rate was 7% or higher even at 11 years after starting the study. And the number of students who stayed in the study were 96%. That means that even though they might skip 1 or 2, overall we still have 92% that were involved in the study, or 97%, sorry, the reading. We also supplemented with what's called the National Student Clearinghouse, which that does is that tells us if people have graduated or not. So even if they don't self-report that they graduated, we can get that graduation information, so we can verify that they finished. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the study. I'm going to tell you kind of our basic findings, whether or not this had any impact. Then I'm going to talk about what elements had impact, and then I'm going to talk about the reasons it had impact. Now, the reasons that it had impact is actually the majority of my talk, so I'm going to fly through these first 2 pieces because I really want to talk about the third part. Okay, the basic answer is yes, it has an impact. Those who are in the RISE are more likely to intend to go on into the sciences than those who don't. And this is all self-report data. Marcia, I'm sorry. It's all self-report.
It's okay.
This is a slide looking at those students who dropped out, those who left, and then those who were matched and those who were in RISE. And again, you can see that those who stayed in RISE were the ones who did the best. You can also see that those who dropped out kind of came in with a little bit of lower interest at the onset. So this is based on whether they intended to continue at the time that they graduated. This is looking at data 7 years later. MTP is a minority training program. So those students, some of our students were in a MARC program, because a lot of times the RISE and the MARC program are connected. The MARC is kind of like the elite part of the RISE program. But you can see that those students who were in RISE and MARC were more likely to go into graduate programs. And they went into med school about at the same rate. They were both grad and med school. And you can see that much less of them went to no grad or med program compared to those who were in the no minority training program. So you can see there's a pretty robust effect from here. Okay, so the next question is what program elements had the biggest impact? And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to tell you about the 2 that have the largest impact. from our research. So how many people here are familiar with mediation analysis? What? Okay, Marcia. Okay, so basically what you want to look at here is being in a rise, how likely, if you're in rise, are you to end up with intentions to pursue? The C is the direct relationship. So what this shows is that if you're in the rise, you are more likely to intend to continue than if you're not in rise. The C prime is telling us there's a drop. How much is research experience mediating this relationship? What that means is that when you're in a rise program and you get the research experience, are you more likely to go into intentions? If it was perfect mediation, this would drop to 0. It would mean only rise students who had research experience intend to go on. So you're looking at this drop here, and the bigger the drop, the more strong the mediation is. So this just tells you that research experience is mediating that. You can see that there is a drop. And so people who are in the RISE program are more likely to go on if they had research experience. Another way to look at it is this way. The top line is research experience. The dotted line are those in the matched group who had research experience. The solid line is the matched without the research experience, and then the dotted line is the matched with no research experience. So you get some boost from being in the minority training program, but the research experience is definitely pushing that. Faculty mentorship, again, it's the same type of mediation thing. You're looking from the C to the C prime. You can see there is a drop. It is significant, not nearly as big as the other one. People often wonder about this. We don't have a huge room of people who are like hardcore scientists, bench scientists, but often people feel like mentors had a huge influence on their lives and in their trajectories. But one of the things that we don't think about is that many of the people who go on in science have good mentors. And the people that have bad mentors often don't go on in science and they're not in the room. So one of the things is having a mentor by itself is not quite as robust an effect as the undergraduate research component, but it also has to do with quality, I think. So the question I had was, why does this research experience have such a large impact? And to answer that question, I am going to tell you a story. So I went to a conference when I was starting out, when the study was really at its very beginning. And at that study, at this conference, it was on why underrepresented minorities don't persist in science. And so I'd been there for one full day. There was, I don't know if you know who Lent is, he does a bunch of work on self-efficacy, and Bob Still was there, and all these people were talking about, like, why do people not persist? And on the second day, I'm there, and I just can't take it anymore, because the whole time they're talking about this efficacy idea that somehow if you just believed in yourself and you felt you could do the work, then you would go on. And I was just frustrated. So I went outside the room. So there's probably about, I don't know, maybe 100 people at this meeting in Washington, D.C., the American Association for University, I don't know, AUW? I don't know what that stands for. Anyway. And I go out there, and there's like 8 other people out there. Okay, so I'm Latina. We're all minorities. We all, have PhDs or MDs. We all had left academia and we're working in other kinds of jobs. We're not in tenure track positions. And we had all left the room on why we had left, on why people leave STEM. And so I started talking to them, like, why did you leave? Why did you leave? Why did you leave? And in talking to them, it became really clear to me that everybody there believed they could do the science. There was nobody there who had left because they didn't feel efficacy around their ability to do the science. They left because they were tired of the social environment. They didn't feel it was hard fighting against the things that were happening in their departments or in their programs, and they just weren't sure if it was meaningful enough to continue on. Like, was it really worth it? And that made me start thinking, and from that conference, I went home and I was reading an article by my advisor, and I thought what my advisor's work was, and this could fit together and perhaps answer some questions that weren't being answered. So, as a social psychologist, one of my thoughts, and one of the things that I assume, is that there's individuals and there's a social context, and these things affect each other. we're all in this room right now. Nobody here is doing cartwheels in the room. Why is nobody doing cartwheels in the room? It's not the norm of the room, right? The norms are to sit in our chairs, and we're all sitting here very politely and very well. There might be somebody whose back bothers them, and we'll get up at some point. But for the most part, we follow the norms of our environment, and we interact with our environment all the time. And so this interaction between the social environment and the individual, I think, had to be taken into consideration in persistence. So this is the model I have used. It's called the tripartite integration model of social influence, also known as TIMSI. And this theory basically says that we integrate into community, and we do this by 3 different types of orientations. We integrate into a community when we feel we can do what the community is asking us to do. That means we feel we have efficacy, we can do what the community wants us to do. The second level is that we feel that we belong, or we identify with that group. So when we start to feel that we identify, then that binds us to that group a little bit more. And then the third level is that we start to internalize the values of that group. That group's values are my values, or you just share them from the get-go. And if you think about any group that you're in that you really value and that's really important to you, you probably can do what the group does. You identify yourself as part of that group and you feel you belong there. And their values are your values. And when you're totally integrated into that community, you start to socialize other people into it in those ways. You teach them to do what the group does. You help them to feel belonging, and you share values and help to shape their values. So the theory is that for a scientist, those people who develop these 3 things, I can do the science, I am a scientist, I agree with the values of the scientist, are going to be more likely to integrate into the community of scientists and therefore persist in science. So that was my theory. And I went back and I collected data and published an article in 2011 that looked at this components. And lo and behold, first of all, they do all significantly correlate with intentions. But then when you do simultaneous, you do a structural equation model, and you can see which ones are uniquely predicting. And interestingly, the unique, oh sorry, those things came off. The unique predictors, I'm going to go back, so that was hard to see, are the science identity and the science values. The efficacy actually wasn't a unique predictor. So this is all underrepresented minorities. So I'm not saying that this is true for white people, but for underrepresented minorities, what we found was that this identity piece and value piece were better predictors of their intentions to persist than the efficacy. So, and I just will say that these are taken, this was measured a year after those. So this is a year later. Okay, so now we're getting to more recent research. So I wanted to know, I published that in 2011, and the next question was, what happens years later? So what happens 4 years after graduation to these components? How well do they predict? And how do we know, how do we look at the research experience and mentorship experiences that they have as undergrads? How does that impact their integration process? And how does this all relate to STEM persistence in the long run? So we looked at the mentorship thing, but we shifted a little bit. We instead of just looking at did they have mentors or not, we actually looked at their responses to whether they had quality mentorship. And these were the questions that we asked, that we used, and became our measurement of quality mentorship. And I'm not going to sit here and go through them all day. If you want to get a copy of this, I'm happy to give it to you. Actually, it's in the publication you can look at. And so we modeled the whole thing. So we have here quality mentorship, research experience, 2 semesters research experience, 1 semester. We have the science efficacy and identity and values, and then we have whether they went into a STEM career, a medical career, or other career in year 4. And what we found is that, so the quality mentorship significantly predicts the efficacy, development, efficacy, and identity and values as undergraduates. And then you can see that it's the science identity that most uniquely predicts going into STEM career, or negatively predicts other careers, and does not have a direct relationship with medical careers. Okay, so for measuring research experience, we asked them questions about if they worked in the laboratory at their current university, they worked in a laboratory at other universities, or they worked on research at another location. If they said they had done this for just 1 semester, 1 research experience, we gave them a 1, and if they had 2 semesters, we had 2, so that's where we got that 1 and that 2 component. And you can see that the 1 semester actually didn't predict anything, but the 2 research experiences, 2 semesters research experiences, significantly predicted the efficacy and identity and values, and then, of course, the other part of the equation is the same, predicting the STEM careers and other careers. So in terms of unique predictors, the science identity seems to be the strongest. If students develop that as an undergraduate, they start to believe and think of themselves as scientists. 4 years later, that seems to be predicting whether or not they stay in STEM or not, which informs our programming, right? That to the extent that we're trying to intentionally or unintentionally build that in our classrooms, in our curriculum, in our programming, that may be a really important component for the longer term decisions that people make. All right. Am I talking really fast? Everybody's laughing. Yes, you are. Okay. I just wanted to point out that, though, if you look at these variables, they are all significantly correlated. So you do the large thing, and you can see what's uniquely correlated. But except for the efficacy and other pathway, all the rest of them are significantly correlated in the directions that you would expect. What that means is that the efficacy at undergrad level does predict whether they're it does correlate with their STEM choice or going into medical or going into other pathways. Okay, I'm gonna move to the next study. Is there any questions about this before I move on? All right. Okay, so the study that we've been doing here is the Gifted Forward study. How many of you have heard about the Gifted Forward study? No? Okay, good. I'm working with John Matsui, who's here in the biology department, and Lilibeth Flores is working with me at UC San Francisco. And we have been taking this model and then trying to look at why a program works well. So instead of looking at kind of the national level, this is more looking at a small program and then seeing why it may be working or not working. So this program, the Biology Scholarship Program, is here at UC Berkeley. It's been going on for 23 years, and it has a really fabulous national reputation for really beating the odds. The students that come into this program actually statistically are very high risk. They're higher risk than normal underrepresented minorities. And they get advising and social support, research opportunities, and they build a community, really, of scholars. And they have had really high and fabulous retention rates in their programs. So you can see here that 74% are women, about 58% are minorities. First generation, there's 70% of their students are first generation students. That means that their parents didn't go to college. The high school API, that has to do with the ranking of the schools, and the lower the rank, the more challenging the high school might be. I found that my high school is a rank of 2, which is a pretty low API. And you can look at their GPA. So you can see that these are students who, if you look statistically, are not the ones who are most likely to succeed on this campus. This comes actually from your institutional research office, looking at the impact of being in the Biology Scholars Program. And you can see that they're almost as likely as any UC Berkeley freshman to graduate with a degree, and they are much more higher than other underrepresented minorities at Berkeley in terms of their GPA and their declaration of a STEM degree. So they've had a lot of success over the years, and one of the questions that John had, who'd been involved in this program for a long time, and actually Missy here, who's just joined as the assistant director for our Biology Scholars Program, whom you should all meet, she's a fabulous person. He wanted to know what they might be doing in the program that was leading to these outcomes. So Howard Hughes Medical Institute gave us a grant, and part of the grant was to figure out what was going on with this group that was successful. So we launched a study in fall of 2014. We currently have, I'm going to report on 5 waves of data. There's 72 participants in the 2014 cohort, which is what we have the longest data for right now, and that's what I'm going to use for this. But we actually have 5 years of data and over 400 participants at this point. Again, it looks a lot like the RISE program, about 75% female, about 44% Hispanic, Latino, say a smaller number of African Americans and Native American and Alaskans. And like you saw on the other slide, in this 75% are first generation students. Okay, so we're looking at efficacy, identity, and values across the first year with this data set. And one of the things you can see from this is that it's pretty steady. So there's no significant differences for these students. They're maintaining their efficacy and their science identity and their values. So it's interesting because in psychology, at least, we're always looking for effects. We're looking for people to, to be really different from each other. But in this case, if you think about when students start and when they're just going through their academic season, a lot of times what happens is people, this is where they start to drop out. So people come in with lots of interest and they want to do this work, and then over time they lose their, so what we want to see is consistency. We want them not losing these things. So I was actually really happy to see these because it shows that they aren't dropping down, which is what somebody would do if they were going to drop out. We also looked at, we collected data from a Bio 1A class and Chem 1A student class, and we looked at those students who had, from the class, who had high intentions to continue in science and those who had low intentions. So the light blue are the science students with high intentions, and that black line is the science students with low intentions. And then that blue, that kind of mid-blue color, is the biology scholar students. So again, remember, statistically, they're less likely to be doing well. But if you look at this, you can see that, that they look a lot like the students who have high intentions to persist in terms of their values and their identity and their efficacy. The intentions don't pay attention to, because that's what we actually blocked on, so that's artificial, and we created those groups. There's also, though, significant difference in terms of stereotype threat, but not in the way of the other ones. If you look at the stereotype threat, you see that biology scholars are reporting higher levels of stereotype threat than the other two groups, whether they were high or low intentions. So in spite of experiencing more stereotype threat, self-reporting that they're experiencing more stereotype threat, they still are maintaining that they they endorse the values of the scientific community, that they identify as scientists, and that they have efficacy. So this is kind of an interesting thing, and if you're wondering what this stereotype threat question is, it's asking them, how often do you feel that because of your ethnicity, some people believe that you have lower ability than other students? People assume that you're not good enough, even if you are similar to other students. If you do poorly on a test, people act like that is normal. Your intelligence is not fairly evaluated. So the biology scholars are saying that they experience that more often, and yet their integration has not deteriorated. We also looked at components of the program to see which correlated with the efficacy and identity of values. So this is their participation in the year 2015, and then their reporting of their integration later that year. And you can see that the more the students attended events and they attended their advising appointments, and overall their total investment in their events attended was related to the efficacy, identity, and climate, but it was not related to the values. So more engagement in the program seems to be related to more integration in the scientific community. And we don't know what direction that is, although those are times, so it looks like the participation was, well, the participation was before these various teams. Okay, so remember the science study from at the beginning? Okay, we're going back to the science study. So I went back to the science study and looked at the first year of data for that, and looked at the students who had stayed in STEM 4 years after, and the ones who had left STEM 4 years after. And what did they look like their first year? So that yellow line are the science studies who didn't get their STEM degree. They didn't get a degree in STEM or BA. But those who did are the blue, and then the BSP are the black. So it's just kind of interesting to look that these BSP students are looking much more like those science students who stayed in even years and years later. Okay, so here's the last part, which is where we get away from kind of the clear data into more kind of theoretical stuff. All right, any questions about the last part? No, okay. You guys are a quiet group. It's hot in here though, isn't it? It's like, I'm hot. Okay, so taking all of this, one of the things that's happening at the national level right now is there's a lot of research going on like what I described. And then there's this question of, can we fix this problem through programs, through a classroom, through mentorship? If we do these individual components, will that be enough to shift the tide of inequity that's happening on campuses? And at the national level, what we're hearing much more is that, yes, all those components are really, really important, but ideally they're part of a larger systemic change that's happening. And we're struggling to understand what does that mean. And in fact, we're struggling to understand that at the national level too. It's not something that's just happening in academia. What does it mean to have an inclusive environment? So remember the web? To have a non-inclusive environment is like this, right? There's some ways in which the institution is not linking up. There's something that's not fitting together. And what is that thing? When I'm around people who are feeling disenfranchised and do not feel inclusion, one of the things you often hear is they don't get it. How many of you have heard that? Don't get it. So women sometimes will talk about men, they don't get it. Or even, someone who is, I don't know, not even, but like Latinos or African, I've heard it many different, any group that's stigmatized, it may have had an experience of the other group not getting it. They don't get their experience. So what is that it? In the paper that I just published in Social Issues Policy Review, actually it's not under review, it just got published about 3 weeks ago. It's called The Influence of Affirming Kindness in Community and Broadening Participation in STEM Career Pathways. It's a review article. It has a lot of good articles and review, actually, Marsha, you're in there. And one of the things that I suggest is that we've done a lot of work on threat. And when we think about threat in our environments, we can think about macroaggressions and microaggressions, right? Macroaggressions are kind of the really obvious ways in which we might feel prejudice or discrimination. We might feel hate or rejection in some way. And then there's been a lot of discussion about this kind of microaggressions, kind of the subtle ways in which we feel those things happening to us. One of the things we don't talk about is the other part of that, which is kindness, what I'm calling kindness. We often put so much emphasis on getting rid of the negative stuff, and yet I would argue that that's not enough. You can get rid of all the negative stuff, and I walk in the room, and if there's no positive at all in the room, that also is detrimental to how I feel being in this room. So I'm thinking about the idea of micro and macro affirmations. So macro affirmations might be the really obvious and blatant ways in which we say there's inclusion, right? You come in the door and there's a big picture in the engineering department of multicolored people and women and men and everything, and then you go into the classroom and there's nobody there but men, white men maybe, or Asian white men, no African Americans. So the macro message is affirming, but then when you're in the classrooms and you're having interactions, the micro affirmation may not be there. The subtle ways in which we feel affirmed. And so I feel that these things, we have to talk about both of them. So one way to think about institutions, and this is the new part. So at one point, we were in really blatant prejudiced institutional environments in academia. There was really high macro and microaggression and very low macro and micro affirmation. And there may be people in this room who experienced that. I would say for myself, I haven't. But that was really blatant. And then we had affirmative action, and we had this movement to try to become un-PC, right? Unpolitically correct, non-politically correct, to be macro-aggressive, although right now in our United States, there's a little bit of hesitation, I would say that. But what happens is that the low macroaggression, there's lower macroaggression, but that this microaggression still is there. And there's an increase in macro affirmation, but there's still a subtlety and lack of micro affirmation. And in that situation, it's ambiguous. If anybody is operating in that environment, it's ambiguous. And I think for many people right now in the United States, we are actually at the national level experiencing an ambiguous environment where we're not sure if it's safe or not. And that situation is a place in which cognitively we have to stay on alert. A person who is in an ambiguous situation and can't determine whether it's threatening or it's inclusive then has to use cognitive power to assess the situation to see if it's safe or not. So when you walk into a classroom, you've got to figure out, do I belong here? Do I not belong here? I'm getting my mixed messages. What does that mean? And it becomes exhausting. What I'm hoping, what we're looking for is more of an inclusive environment where there's actually very, very low micro and macro aggression and that there's very high micro and macro affirmation. And the last thing I want to say is I don't think that these are hydraulic. As one goes up, the other one goes down. I think you can have actually all of them high or all of them low. I think they move independently from one another. But we need these things. And we don't talk about them, we don't measure them, and we don't really understand them. And we've definitely underutilized them and thought about them. And I sent this paper to a colleague I don't know how to explain him. He calls himself a senior postdoc. He retired and now is doing work at HHMI. And I sent him the paper, and he's usually very critical. But when he wrote back, he said, "This might explain why some programs have all the same components, and some work and some don't work." Because it's not just the curriculum. It's not just the program that you're doing. It's not just the mentorship that you're giving. It is the interaction, the social interaction, and that also has importance. That being said, we need curriculum change. We do need good mentorship. We do need good underrepresented or undergraduate research experiences and research experiences. We do need to measure the quality of those things through self-report and non-self-report things. We need all of that. I'm not saying we don't need that, but in addition to that, we need to understand that there's a social component, and it's really powerful, and it's fatiguing. It's fatiguing to be in an ambiguous or prejudiced environment. So one thing I've been doing in all my talks when I give this is asking where this institution is. So I'm going to say, are we here, in between these two, here, between these two, or here? How many people in the room think that UC Berkeley is a prejudiced institutional environment right now? Okay, how about between prejudiced and ambiguous, kind of in the middle? Okay, how about ambiguous? How about between ambiguous and inclusive? Okay, so far, most of the people have put between prejudice and ambiguous. That was about half of you. Okay, how about inclusive? How many people are having an inclusive experience at Berkeley right now? Nobody. One person. Okay. Nice.
But I'm white female, so.
Well, it's good working for somebody. So, I've been doing this at different universities and really getting different responses. It's really, really fascinating to me to see. But people kind of know, and there seems to be like a general consensus. And I've done this at Berkeley 3 times now. Every time it has been between prejudice and ambiguous, has been a majority. So it's pretty consistent here that people know what they're experiencing. All right. So if we want to know what kinds of things to do, I'm just going to point you towards a few things. This was a paper that we published about 2 years ago and it has recommendations for how to improve underrepresented minority student persistence in STEM. These are the things that we recommended. But one of the key components that I think is really, really important to emphasize is we are at a time now when we have an opportunity to collect data at the institutional level to know when we're doing the right thing and when we're not doing the right thing. And we haven't been doing that very well. So we don't know what departments actually have good retention rates. It's hard to know what the ethnic makeup of departments are actually when you go to campuses. It's hard to know when programs are doing well. So collecting data at a national level and at institutions in similar ways so we can compare institutions and we can compare departments would be a great way to start. And the rest of these kind of follow from that. So I encourage you to look at that. I also have here the report that we did from undergraduate research experience, which has a lot of really good information in it about all of this, actually. And so I encourage you to look at that. And I'm just going to end with this, that maybe a successful STEM education institution reflects what a successful society looks like. That there is competence, that there's creativity, that there's kindness, that there's well-being. That these things that make us enjoy our own community and our country when it's moving in that direction, that these things actually are essential components also to a STEM education. So think about that. And I'm going to say thank you for your time. I'm willing to take questions. If you want to reach me, that's my email address. And I have a blog that I started on kindness. It's called Lead with Kindness. It doesn't have this heavy stuff, but if you're interested in the concept of kindness, there's a bunch of things that I've been writing there, and you're welcome to go there and read. So, there we go.
Would you definitely take questions?
Is it too much? Okay, tell me this. Is it true, or do you think I'm wrong? Go ahead, Bob.
You have no specific best practices or exemplars of trying to think about kindness and affirmation that have been successful?
No, this is all new. So as far as I can tell, I couldn't find any research that's been done on the concept of kindness. I found one sentence in a positive psychology book about it. I don't know, I'm really at this point trying to think about how do we measure it? How do we know when it's there? I think intuitively we know when it's there and when it's not there, but I don't think we've actually talked about measuring it within the context of a classroom or a mentorship relationship or in a training program. So that's the next step, is how do I actually measure these things and make them so, because I think that we move towards what we can measure. If we can't measure it, it's hard to know whether we're doing it or not. And it's a subtle thing, because it's not just what we say, it's how we do it. And a lot of times the more a person has experienced prejudice and racism, the better they are at reading microaggression and affirmation. And so it's not something people can fake. It comes through eye contact, it comes from all different ways in which people hold their bodies. It's very, very subtle. So I don't know if we can train for it. I think maybe we actually have to become a kinder people. Yes.
I'm just curious about kind of how people develop identity in this environment and kind of what you see as the art, because identity is continuously important in all the variables that in all the studies and all the pathways that you've investigated. And I think in some cases people come to these experiences having already created an academic or STEM identity.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious as to, from your own personal perspective and reading a lot and thinking a lot, both where does it come from and how can we improve it?
Yeah. I mean, part of the reason why I started moving towards these ideas of kindness and stuff is because of that question. Because I think a key component to our identity is feeling as if we belong within that group. And how is that conveyed to us, whether we belong to a group or not? And I think that does come back into kind of the interpersonal relationship component that is subtle or not subtle. There's an interesting study by Nalini Ambati about professors where they come in and they give their opening lecture, and it's a thing called thin slices. Actually, this research was cited in the book Blink. But Nalini Ambati was in graduate school with me, and I was around when she was developing this study, and she had these little thin slices of teacher teaching, and she showed it to 3 students, and the video would have it either where you could hear them talking, or you could just hear the intonation of them talking, or you couldn't hear anything at all. So the 3 students would watch, first she had 5 minutes of it, and then she reduced it to 1 minute. She kept going smaller and smaller and smaller until it was a very thin slice. I think it was 30 seconds of material. And then they would rate how good they thought that teacher was, how effective they were as a teacher. They would rate the overall, the evaluation that you would do at the end of the semester. And she correlated their measures based on 15 seconds of a thin slice with, you couldn't hear their words, you could only hear their intonation pattern. Their prediction of how good that professor was with the end of the year evaluation of that professor. And it was significantly related. They could predict with 15 seconds of slice of somebody's behavior how good that professor was going to be. And that's how fast people read somebody. And we're not always accurate, and if you read Blink, you'll hear about all the different kind of research, but in many ways we are very good at it. So that identity development, I think some of that identity development comes from that subtle information that we're getting from the people within the group that we're trying to belong to or do we do not belong to. And if we're getting information that we feel like they're not like me, I can't relate to them, they clearly don't like me, they don't understand me, all those things I think feed into our identity development. And the other thing that we have to think about is that we have multiple identities, we don't just have one. So for some identity groups, social identities that we have, there might be compatibility, right? So for me, I'm trying to think of what Mexicans are supposed to be good at. Anybody know? What are we supposed to be good at? Maybe cooking. I wouldn't have, so a cook and being Mexican perhaps would not be in conflict in my head, because in my mind, Mexicans can cook. So those are compatible social identities. But if I had one that I thought like being a scientist and being Mexican, those seem like really different things. And so some people will integrate those identities. Some people will start to just kind of let one die and let the other one emerges. And some will live with a lot of conflict. And I have one study that I didn't talk about today, which is a longitudinal study with Native American graduate students in STEM. And we've been tracking and doing something like the science study, but we have 3 years of data on 100 graduate students who are Native American. And one of the things that's coming up with them is just the conflict between the cultural values and the STEM community. Like there's this definitely a tension between the cultural identity and this academic identity. And the negotiating of that is really important, and having role models and mentors and stuff that can help you identify that even though I'm Native American and I'm a biologist, there's another person like that. That's another way to develop your science identity is you have role models, people that are like you, that are in that group. And that seems to be important, at least for the Native American data that I have been collecting. So we're learning about how that professional identity is developed and maintained. But I think it has a lot to do with belonging. Yeah. So it makes you wonder, thinking about our current situation at the national level, what is happening to our identities right now, and how many people are feeling threatened, as if, what is America, and am I American, and if I am American, then who are they? I think there's a lot of struggle going on right now about this web of our country, and it's not just happening in the academic environment. All right. Yeah, I see hands kind of they're like this.
I'll go, I guess. So I participate and co-founded a CS Scholars program on campus for computer science students, undergraduates. And it was initially modeled after the BSP program, and we met with John Matsui, several times. It was great. We've been around now for 5 years, and overall, we find that firstly, we select, it's important to say, we select for students without any prior background in computer science, and that may have come from underserved populations, whether that's by API, being underrepresented students in terms of ethnic or gender identity, et cetera. So we select across those components, and we've found, that they perform better. Overall, females are now performing like an entire grade point better in our gauntlet, prereq class. Underrepresented students, less so. But what I've been finding is that we have these subpopulations who are just not really improving nearly as much as the whole group overall, and the cross sections of just looking at gender, for instance. Particularly ethnicity, and I see a lot of the reasons that could be, given our climate in our department, being a giant 4,000 undergrad students attending or majoring at any given time. But I'm curious if you have any ideas around how to increase their sense of belonging or their integration, their trust, whatever, aside from kind of, things that you've gone over a little bit already, or the usuals. Because we have all those components. We have the seminar that I teach. For the students who start in their first semester, where we actually talk about climate and CS and diversity and why it's important and why is it missing and what's going on and stereotype threat, imposter syndrome, et cetera. And a quick orthogonal point to what you were just saying is I've noticed teaching that seminar for 10 semesters now that in the last year, let's say, I'll describe that one, I've seen a fairly profound difference in the level of initial trust from the students, being that I'm like a white guy standing in front of them, firstly, and the population is quite diverse. It's usually around 30 to 40% underrepresented students and at least 50% female, whereas, let me tell you, it's not the department representation at all, right? So it's a different population. But now it takes me several weeks to even build up the trust or to try to establish some semblance of a safe space where they can speak openly. And I have noticed that happened, within 3 months of, coincidentally possibly, the election. So I definitely hear what you're saying.
I don't believe in coincidences. Okay, well, let me unpack that a little bit.
It's a lot.
So
Sorry.
one of the things you're saying is that it is working.
Overall,
Overall, it is working, and then there's some people who are disenfranchised.
yes.
Still feeling disenfranchised. And so there's a couple things in there. People are different. There's some people who actually, despite all of my data, all they need is efficacy. They can do it. They really don't need that identity and value thing, and they'll just go on and they'll make it no matter what. They don't, screw you, I'm going to just do it. So there are individual differences, and there's only so much. Everything's an interaction, individual in the context. So there are going to be some contexts that work for people and don't work for other people. So that's one thing. So there's always going to be people who don't necessarily fit in. There's really great research by Rudy Denton Mendoza. Do you know his work? Who's in the psychology department and who's now what's Rudy doing now? He's the vice something for equity and inclusion or something. So Rudy's work looks at friendship. And I actually cite this in the paper that's in the Social Issues Policy Review. And he looks at the importance and how powerful establishing friendships are for people staying in academia. So he doesn't study STEM, but he's looking at the academic environment. And again, that's another place where people don't have any friends. It goes back to the kindness, they may have no enemies, but if you have no friends, it's also really hard. So looking at the friendship networks might be really important.
And that's certainly something we can.
Yeah. So I think that answers your questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. There was a question back here, but you have one still?
I think it got addressed with the identity. It was an identity question and kind of getting a little bit more understanding about like your working definition of that and how it relates to their sense of belonging in the community. Like, are they synonymous? Are they?
This is a really great question. Let me just tell you, because I really wrestle with this. There's a literature that's on belonging, and there's a literature that's on identity. And most of the measures for both of those things relate to each other pretty heavily. And they seem really, really interrelated to me. And as I'm speaking, I use them both interchangeably pretty readily. And I know that they're supposed to be separate constructs, but really, the measure I use has both components in it. So I don't know if really the experience of belonging is so, I think belonging maybe is the mechanism in which we develop our identity. Maybe that's one way to think about it. But I don't think that they happen individually. I developed my social identity, I guess you could do it without feeling belonging, but it's probably easier if you feel you belong. So it's a great theoretical question. I think there's a great paper to be written on that. Somebody should write a review article. Because I think that those have not been really wrestled with. And some people use one, some people use the other, and some use them together. I tend to use them more together. But I think theoretically we don't really know.
So I was struck with on that slide about the school environment, about it feeling, I think it was like prejudice, ambiguity, inclusive institutional environment. I'm wondering, in your study with the the biology scholars program. Was there anything in terms of, I'm not sure if like this is self-efficacy, but like let's say that many of the BSP feel like what the typical Berkeley student feels, which is something between prejudice institutional and ambiguous institutional. Like, is there like anything in BSP that sort of foregrounds the sort of like foregrounds like something about how to make that environment work for you? And
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because do programs or classrooms or mentorship experiences that are positive create a microclimate that is inclusive, which then acts as a buffer so that people can tolerate the non-inclusive environment? Or are these programs in some ways teaching the students how to navigate this non-inclusive environment more effectively? And I don't know the answer to that question, but those are two different things, right? One is this environment sucks, but I have a little place here with all my friends, and so it creates a little place where I can retreat to. I go out, I'm in the storm and in the war, I come back in and I have a place where I belong, where other scientists like me are. And I would say that anecdotally and from like focus groups and from those kinds of things, that's what I hear more of, is that this provides me this little place. And there's a lot of evidence that people who have networks, like, so young scholars, there was a research project on early faculty Latina women, and those who had support networks at other minorities were more likely to publish and all those kinds of stuff. So there's a good amount of research showing that if you have these micro affiliations and networks, it really helps you. I have not seen any evidence so far that somehow they are making you more resilient and more capable of dealing with this larger thing. It's more like it gives you a little place. And another question is whether or not once you've had that and you leave the environment and you don't have that anymore, then what happens to you? And there's now, because of the internet and stuff, there's online programs that you can be involved in. Like I'm in a faculty diversity program. So I have an online network of like 6 people that we keep in touch with each other we're all across the United States, but that group is kind of a place I can go to when I need to, yes.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, it seems like the data that you presented here seems to speak to it a bit, because you have the students who are persisting and they still have the same level of identity even once they're out of that special program.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're out in the real world or whatever, but
Yeah.
they're dealing with it. So I think the question becomes, are they like you? Are they persistent and successful there? Because like you, they have replicated that.
Yeah, they kept groups.
Yeah, in this other environment. And so I wonder if adding additional follow-up question
That's a great question.
you know, do you have these networks in your current, state or not?
It's a great question. I mean, if you have had positive experience, then are you more likely to replicate that as you go through your career and look for it? I don't know. I mean, for me, yes. I don't know what it's like for. When I went to Harvard, there was only 2 Mexican Americans that got into graduate school in my year in the arts and science department. So I joined the Mexican folklorico. I did Mexican dancing, so that I could have a group. Because there was not enough in my department or in my, so, and that was like across the whole campus. And it was half national Mexicans, but we all danced, and that was really, so I've always looked, I did. How about you? Have you looked?
No, but I traditionally have not.
Yeah, traditionally. So I don't know, I mean, when you're not the majority, I don't know if people know instinctively to go look for groups or not, but I do see that it's a powerful component, and I wonder if you have had it as an undergrad, if you're more likely to do it going onwards. It's a great question, another great question. Did I wear you guys out yet?
No.
Okay, there's food in the back.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.